Welcome to Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future with Dr. Bill Choby. Doc is a historian and a reenactor. On this show, you'll hear his thoughts about our personal liberties from their earliest recorded beginnings. You'll also be transported back to the 1750s to relive the life of Colonel George Washington and his adventures during the French and Indian War. Let's get started. Here's Dr. Bill Choby.
Hello again, it's Dr. Bill Choby. We've been talking about liberty in America, past, present, and future. And much of this is based upon my own personal experiences in this next chapter. This has to do with the economics of liberty. Now, think about, how much freedom you'd have if you didn't have any money. Well, money in your hand allows you to do a lot of things. And in order to have that, we've got to be able to understand what the economics of our freedom is about and the role that government plays in this. Few people understand the origin of American capitalist society. Now, mind you, many people think that socialism is good because there was in the Bible in the Acts of the Apostles, the new believers got together, they pooled their resources. And so that sort of set the idea into the head of many that if it was good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for everybody. But that really was the way they structured it was not exactly what we would call socialism, because it was based upon the free giving and with the understanding that giving to the Lord, giving to others through tithes and offerings would lead to greater blessings as well. Socialism has taken that to develop what's called liberation theology, and part of that is really to create a myth about the moral superiority of socialism. It's something that we've really become more and more aware of it within the past couple of years with what's happened to the United States federal government. But the idea of capitalism, which essentially capitalism means privatism or property. Socialism is not privacy, and it means that you don't have control over your property because you're sort of putting it all in the middle of the bucket and people take as they need. So capitalism really is a misnomer. It's a poorly understood term because it's poorly understood. And we really should be talking about socialism versus privatism or personalism to really get the full concept of what the term means. Capitalism. Remember that our Declaration of Independence said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that term was carried over into our Constitution, life, liberty, and property, and even affirmed in the 14th Amendment, life, liberty, and property. That's really what capitalism means, private property. And it's really what we have to remember when we're getting into conversations with people who push the idea of democracy and socialism. It's mixing half-truths with lies in order to enhance the veracity of the lie. But it's like mixing apples and oranges. But when you do that, you end up with a fruit salad rather than something that's clearly defined. And this is what the left will do. It's a clever trick. You mix a little truth with a bigger lie, and you can say it's morally superior to what truth would provide. Well, the truth is, if we look at it from a biblical standpoint, and particularly in the parable of the talents, we can learn from that when the master went away and left 10 coins into the hands of his servant, that he expected that to be invested and used until he returned. The same was the story with the 5 coins. and the individual with the 10 coins and the 5 coins both used it wisely, but the one that got the 1 coin was so afraid of losing it that he buried it. And at the end of that parable, the master admonitioned the servant for being foolish, and he took the one that he had given him, he took it away again. So the idea of mixing everything together in a big pot and everybody takes what they need, there's the core tenement of communism, and socialism is just a gradual way to get there. But in America, the idea of properties, personal property, was unique back at the time of the Pilgrims when they landed in 1621. Their intent was to build a city of God, literally a new Jerusalem. And so they used what they thought they interpreted their Geneva Bibles to say as how they were to relate to one another in their Mayflower Compact. You recall that we referenced that as the first written agreement between free men to govern themselves in Western civilization. And it was the foundation, the idea was the foundation that served as a blueprint for our later constitutions. But this happened the first year that the Pilgrims were off the Mayflower, landing on Plymouth Rock. And by the way, I may have mentioned before, the water level's the same at Plymouth Rock then as it is today, and there's no global warming, and Manhattan Island's not going to be submerged. It's all a myth. It's all part of that mixing apples and oranges, and then you get fruit salad, remember. So when the Pilgrims landed, they were not in good shape physically, but they were able to put together some sort of farmland or some sort of crops. Remind you that the Algonquin Indians who had cleared the land became infected with smallpox, brought over by the different explorers, European explorers, and that wiped out their community there. But they left behind the fields that were ready to be plowed and worked. So the Pilgrims went in there and they did this communal type living thing. And by the time the fall came around, everybody felt that, well, there's going to be enough. But it turned out that there wasn't. And following spring, many of them were dying of starvation and other diseases related to exposure and malnutrition. So the governor at that time, William Bradford, saw that this was something that they repeated it for another year. There wouldn't be much of their colony left. So he came up with a solution where he offered 7-acre tracts of land and multiples of that for each family member. And so each of the families had their own tract of land, and he basically said, he posted a quote from St. Paul's second letter to Thessalonians, chapter 3, verse 10, and he put this on the door of the community hall, and basically it says, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. I remember that the Pilgrims that were living there in destitution had nothing more to do than to try to do something. But if they sat around and expected, the manna from heaven, they were sorely misinformed that that's the way it worked. But when Governor Bradford instituted this idea and people got to work, 7 acres per family member, they ended up with such a harvest that they led to a celebration, and that was the very first Thanksgiving in America. So here they showed this kind of approach of not being tied to this idea that we have to share everything, and that you basically took care of yourself, led to surprising results. They had more than enough for the entire community, and the following year they actually started to grow. So keeping that in mind, as we look at after that, the migrants that came from Europe, many of them were outcasts. Many of them were trying to flee debt. They came here and they didn't have the same kind of work ethic that they otherwise they would have, had they been successful, they probably would have stayed in Europe. But these were people that were on the run in many cases, looking for a place to build a new life. So some of them came over as indentured servants. In other words, they promised to, if somebody would pay their passage, they would promise them so many years worth of service. And if you recall, there was indentured servitude was something that was banned by one of the amendments of the Constitution, along with slavery. But by the way, we see indentured servants right now with what's going on our southern border with a lot of those unoccupied or unaccompanied youngsters who are sold off into sex slavery and into various kinds of indentured servitude. But it's supposedly banned in our country, by the way, and you have to wonder, why the Biden administration continues to allow this to happen when it's a clear violation, but doesn't seem to bother him much. So as people sort of come over and expecting somebody to give them something for nothing, I quickly found out that that's a quick way to starve. And so but the opportunities were there through the land and through all the natural resources, that it developed this what we call the Protestant work ethic. In other words, basically it was a matter of you take care of yourself, and that doesn't mean that you're being selfish. It's just a matter of common sense. It's a matter of survival. So taking care of oneself later on, as explained at length by Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and it's a good read, by the way, if you're into economics. He shows that basically by improving yourself, you help the lives of others. By solving a problem of others, you enhance yourself, or you have reward for it. So in order to see a free nation grow, there has to be cooperation of talents and cooperations of effort for whatever one's talents may take them. So the idea of the Yankee ingenuity and the hard scrabble type of approach to life, it didn't mean that it was any easier. It was just that it was a method that worked. But as time went on, and of course our country grew, and there was less ability or less need to be out there, clearing land, things like that. Cities started to develop, and with cities and populations, and there was divisions of labor, and you had maybe one man was a tanner, another was a physician, another one was made wooden kegs. You get the idea. So there was a specialization of labor. But in order for that to work, again, one had to use their talents, God-given talents, to make something or to do something that solved a problem for somebody else. And in return, they were paid for it. So that solved their problem. By helping others, we help ourselves. This, I guess, is really the simplest way to look at that. When we come up to the Civil War, now remember again, we talked a little bit before about how the development of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. And basically the cotton gin, it would separate the fibers of cotton from the seeds. So they would have pure cotton to take to the mills, and they'd spin them out and those sorts of things and make fabrics out of them. The South was highly, the growth of the South was greatly enhanced by the cotton. Cotton was a very sought after commodity, and many of the crops from the South prior to the Civil War were sent to England, and this was created an imbalance of trade, if you will, between the North and the South, because of the ease of being able to pick cotton. They had an abundance of unskilled labor, and it really made quite the difference in what had formerly been an agricultural area that depended upon the growth of tobacco. Incidentally, in the early colonies in Virginia, it was growth of tobacco was against the law, and if you possessed the tobacco seeds, it was punishable by death. So most of the English tobacco was grown in the Caribbean area. They didn't want it in America, but somebody brought some in, and next thing you know, they're growing tobacco, and of course, tobacco is in great demand over in Europe, and it became a real powerful boost to the economy of the South. But it took a lot of intense labor to make it profitable, and therefore it had fewer hands on it. And of course, the price for what they got for it was enough to sustain the economy of the South. But the Civil War came around, and all of a sudden there was this great demand for a lot of new technology, as every war does. It's always about building better weapons in order to defeat the enemy. Here we had interstate movement going on with railroads. We had the shipping industry up and down the Mississippi River, the whole way up to Pittsburgh. And these sorts of things, that the need for ability to make products that could be shipped to feed armies, developing things like canned food was just a real important asset for an army to have. Later it was described that as an army travels on its stomach. Well, if you can't keep your soldiers fed, they're not going to fight very well. But somebody came up with the idea that you could solder the lids on tin cans and food would be preserved. Prior to that, all the other foods, such as in the earlier campaign, the French and Indian War, they would keep cabbage in basically salt water, and of course salt pork, and that was their diet. But when it came with the Civil War and all the mobility involved, they were able to transport that through the railroads and things like that. So there was a great demand for industrial products, and this is probably why the North was able to succeed in the Civil Wars, because of the industrial revolution that had been taking place in their cities, where in the South didn't have that advantage. They pretty much had to import any of the technologies of war. So there was, by the end of the 19th century, these large companies that created a lot of this these industrial products, they're in great demand for workers, and the workers were imported from Europe, including my grandfather. They were promised that the coal companies and the steel companies would go over to Europe and Middle Europe and to some of these poor countries and offer them passage to the U.S. if they would work here. So they would come over, and when they got to Rikers Island, they would, of course, check them and make sure they weren't sick. If you were sick, you weren't admitted. But if you were admitted, then these companies would greet these men and say, "What do you want to do? You want to work in the coal mines, or you work in the steel mills?" And if you're in coal mines, you go one way, and steel mills to another. They pack them all in on the railroads, and off they go. And this is what happened with my grandfather. He came here, and then he worked the coal mine. First year here, he lived in what was called Poverty Flats, and that was not uncommon for many of the immigrants that came here seeking a better way of life. It was much better than what they had, but it was the growth of the technology that demanded all this labor had a huge effect on the economy of sorts. And with these large companies beginning to abuse the laborers, it wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt came along after the assassination of McKinley, traveling in through Pennsylvania on a train through the coal fields of Clearfield County, Center County, and he saw that the masses of Europeans, and particularly the Slovaks, from which my ancestry comes, how they were being mistreated. And from that, then he intervened with to settle some strikes that were going on between the coal and the railroads and the owners of the coal mines. And so that was the first time that a president got involved with labor. But out of all of that, it was necessary because in Roosevelt's mind, that the production of the availability of coal was something that was of national interest. So he went out of line to do this. It wasn't a traditional role of the president to do it, but he did. And it was because he was touched by what he had seen riding on the train coming down through Pennsylvania after he was sworn in. Now, at that time, there was also a lot of push between the progressives. I think we mentioned before that President Wilson was a real progressive, and he was also a racist, but he believed in the administrative state, and he believed that we could study the administrative states of foreign governments and learn something from them. And there might be something to be said for that. But the real change in the economics of liberty came with the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913. And remember, it was sold to be only at the highest level is supposed to be at 7% for the so-called rich. But by the end of the decade, the First World War, that top rate had risen to like 73%. And the end result of this high tax rate was that the federal income tax revenue dropped, and they actually had a national debt that ballooned to like $24 million. I mean, it's a mere pittance today in our terms, but 24 million then, 24 billion then is probably like $1 trillion today when you figure how many times the dollar's been devaluated. But after the success of World War I, there was a new spirit in America that we could do anything. We became a world power, and money was available. Because of the war effort, there was a lot of jobs that were going on, and again, technology boosting the availability of goods and services even into the rural parts of the country. So America felt pretty good about itself, and this is what they call the Roaring Twenties. When people got it was happy days were here again, and they were spending their money and not necessarily very wisely. And after a while, they thought they could get rich by just investing in the stock market. Well, as we know, by the end of that decade, that that all went up in smoke. But President Calvin Coolidge, during the time of the 20s when he was president, he brought the tax rates down, and that was the lowest or the highest rate for the rich was 25%, and the tax revenue federal income tax revenue increased threefold. This was able to used to reduce the national debt to 18 billion. Remember, it was 24 billion before they had the tax cut. So cutting taxes, which generated greater revenue, was something that caught the eye of Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. And he saw that lowering the rates of the high tax rates on the wealthy led to increase in revenues flowing into the national treasury. And the reason being is that people of means or people of wealth have the resources to move their money away with investments and things such that they can avoid taxes. And you can't blame them for doing it, but it was the golden rule of money, which is he who has the gold rules, and they had the gold, and they had the ability to do things that the average person could not. So, but then along came President Herbert Hoover, and so he started to spend some of the surpluses with more government programs. And remember, more government programs take away freedom. The more government you have, the less freedom you have, the less liberty you have. So with the foolishness of the Roaring Twenties, we've got the get rich quick type of schemes on Wall Street, and people invested money in the stock market. And then with that, when it crashed, everybody had a real serious problem. So we went from like unemployment of less than 1%. Now we're into the 15 and 20% unemployment. And on top of that, there was the Dust Bowl days. Now, let's go back a little bit here. Back in 1889, Congress declared 2 million acres of land in the Oklahoma Territory that had been seized from the natives, and they claimed to be part of the public domain. So soon after that, the federal government offered 160 acres of land for free to anybody willing to settle there. So there was a big rush, and people went and laid out their claims, and things were looking pretty good. And then by the 20s, we had mechanized farm equipment, which was using the moldboard plow, which is the kind of plow that turns the the ground over, and it looks like a little row, if you will. And they did this over tens of thousands of acres without much regard to what happens when you expose all that land. These are the great prairies where, buffalo and antelope and all that lived for hundreds of years, if not longer. And the ground was deeply rooted in the grasses of the prairies. Well, when they turned them over to generate other crops, they eventually overused the land, and the soils left to dry out. And then, of course, the Midwest can get very warm, and with that on top of everything, and a lack of rain, the wind came along and it carried a lot of the topsoil away as dust, and even as far away as Washington, D.C. You can imagine that. So this was a huge problem, but it was devastating to the price of food. So here we have the crashing of the Wall Street crash, and then we have the top of the Great Dust Bowl adding on to it. And the end result is that people were really in a hard way, in a bad way. And after having personally experienced 26% unemployment in my hometown of Johnstown, I can tell you that people do some pretty strange things when money gets really tight. So all of this pain and suffering was going on. There was this group of people calling for the government to intervene. And then along comes Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he had this theory that he was basing his policies on. It was called Keynesian economic theory. And basically what it was, whenever things got bad, the government would have to step in with spending, even borrowing money to do it. And that way they would jumpstart the economy, and happy days would be here again. Well, that's not exactly what happened. But because we had from the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was set up in 1887, I think we talked about that before, and the fourth branch of government, FDR used this model to continue to expand the federal government, not only in influence and in areas, but they also they needed money to do things. So instead of having people working out their own problems using what was available to them locally, now that federal government was going to go and fix everything. So people took their eyes off of their own needs and their own abilities. They started listening to FDR's talk about how he's going to fix everything, and then so that's how he got elected, and reelected and reelected and reelected. But at the same time, the personal freedom was being taken away because they gave up a little freedom for their security, which Ben Franklin warned us greatly about. But in the throes of destitute, they were willing to take anything. But remember what the Pilgrims did. They got to work. Whenever you had FDR coming along and offering money, people stopped work. So here we have a number of his efforts were challenged before the Supreme Court and found to be unconstitutional, but he really didn't care because the money had already been spent and he got what he wanted done. So he talked about trying to expand the courts so he could have more influence there and do more of his growth of government. But remember, this was all about the economics of what was going on at the time. So one of the bigger things that FDR also did is he took us off the gold standard, which was constitutionally mandated in Article 1, Section 10. And that when you take the standard off of a currency, there's a reason that there's a certain value to that standard, is because the amount or the availability of that, the gold or whatever precious metals, that there's a limited supply. Because there's a limited supply, finite supply, at the time when the value was made, it stabilizes the currency value. But when you take the gold standard away and you start looking at this value determined by basically economics or whatever, it can become anything very quickly. So without that finite ability or finite amount of the standard of the monetary unit, then they're off to the races, and here comes inflations, and here comes the value of the dollar dropping. It becomes negotiable. With the standard of gold, it was not negotiable because there was a finite amount of them. So with that, then FDR is cruising along through the Great Depression, and he has his fireside chats and things. Japanese saw us as being weak, and because of our troubles, and they decided to attack us on December 7th, 1941, and that was a day of infamy. And there we were now facing a war on two fronts. And because this was the mood of nationalism, really got us out of the Depression. And it wasn't FDR's Keynesian economics. It was that people finally said, look, it's something that's very important to all of us. We have to get together. World War II galvanized the country. And because the country became galvanized, they had a target, a goal, beat the enemy. They all chipped in, and everything was fine. The economy started to move. And all the technology, of course, they were making cars, and car dealers or car manufacturers were making tanks, and ships and things like that, and weapons of war. And but it got everybody to stop thinking about the troubled times of the economy and to focus on survival of the nation. Of course, there's debt involved, and we undertook a lot of debt to do it, but ultimately we emerged from World War II as being the world superpower, the only world superpower. Now, along comes into the 40s and 50s, we had other conflicts, such as the nuclear threat, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, and we also had the competition for space. That's what the Russians put their first monkey up there as Sputnik, and we eventually, President Kennedy challenged us to go to the moon, which we did in 1969. But all of this stimulated the economy through national products or national projects. So there was more of a top-down ordering, but the advancements and the technology that came out of reaching these goals had improved the lives of all Americans. Teflon, for example, we take for granted, that came out of the space race. Different types of dehydrated foods, different types of metals such as titanium that came out of the space race. And the way we take those things for granted, I mean, I use titanium every day when I use my dental implants. So that titanium came out of the space exploration. So there were a lot of advantages, a lot of great things come out of it, but it was a top-down kind of project. But the Kennedy administration, they understood the economics of freedom, and John Kennedy brought the taxes down, and lo and behold, there they were. The revenues to the coffers of the federal government increased, and things were moving along until he was assassinated. And we find lately that it was the CIA that killed him. I remember those days. I know exactly where I was sitting in my grade school classroom when it came over the intercom that Kennedy was shot. Well, after Kennedy was gone, then Johnson came in. Now, Johnson was a senator from Texas who was just not a good guy. He was embittered. He had a lot of political enemies that he hated, and there was a couple of ministers in Texas who began speaking out against him from the pulpit, and he didn't like that. So he got the Senate to put together a bill that was supposedly to silence political talk from the pulpit, and that really had a profound effect. And the idea was that if you were using the pulpit to speak about politics, in this case it was about LBJ, you would lose your tax exempt status. So they're using the IRS as a weapon to silence their critics, something we've seen more of locally too. But LBJ was just not a good guy. But he was president because of Kennedy's assassination. And I think the only reason he was vice president prior to that was because he was from Texas and they needed the votes. Well, LBJ comes along with this idea of a great society. He's going to solve poverty in Appalachia. He's going to solve poverty all over the country. And they started a whole number of different welfare programs. that supposedly was going to make it fair for everybody. But as time went on, it became rather clear that all this money that was going into the Great Society programs, that very little of it actually made it down to the hands of the people who needed it the most. It created great bureaucracies, which also was populated by people who made a lot of money for good salaries and good benefits with retirement and all that sort of stuff. But the guy that they're supposed to be helping out down the bottom of the ladder is getting very little of this. But at the same time, because there was such a politically charged way of doing this, and it was solving the war, it was called the war on poverty. Winning the war on poverty was something that was popular. So when it came around that they were running out of money, and you have the Vietnam War going on at the same time, well, LBJ couldn't leave well enough alone. He started tapping into the Social Security trust funds and promising to pay him back someday. So he left an IOU in there. And ever since doing that, the Social Security Trust Fund has been funding, government projects that had nothing to do with preserving the funds that people who paid into Social Security would expect to get at some point in return in their lives. So what was happening was that these social safety nets were becoming more of a hammock than for the dependent class. And of course, with that, there was a permanent class of voters, and that's really what LBJ wanted. And he made a comment that, give them welfare things, and those N-word will vote for Democrats forever. He actually said that, if you look it up on Google. So this was really it was an attempt to coalesce his power for a very unpopular president doing an unpopular war. But it's what they did. And, looking at those Great Society programs that continue to this day, they basically amount to about as much as our national debt prior to the Biden administration. So at the same time with this, in the 50s and 60s, and these, again, I remember because I lived these years, there was also a big cultural change that went on. The World War II generation came out. They were toughened by the experience, and they were sick and tired of war, and they're sick and tired of destruction, and they raised their families in a way that had not been prior available in this country. And it meant that there was affluence to where the kids could go to school, they had safe communities, they could aspire to different things, and they'd have a future. Well, on top of all of that, we also had technological advancements in medicine. I remember as a kid we were getting polio shots because there were young people getting polio, and they couldn't breathe. They had to live in an iron lung all their lives. I mean, that's a scary kind of thing, but Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh developed the vaccine, and we used to get shots in our arm, or later on you would just take a sugar cube. But I remember standing up in line getting those things. So that's happened. But also, you've had a major change happen with women, because it came about with the development of the birth control pill. And because of that, they could control pregnancy or avoiding pregnancy. That freed them up to do a lot of the things that they felt they wanted to do. And the whole push for to become involved with careers rather than families had a profound effect on the future growth of the country and the country's the labor and population. At this time, then, we also had the Planned Parenthood people who was founded to reduce the population of the blacks in America, and this through abortion services and things like that. And currently, they've been very successful at this. And currently, there's more black babies aborted in New York City than there are that are born. But it was a racist thing. Planned Parenthood and abortion was a racist thing, but it brought about, because of these offers about how government's welfare programs would take care of people, take care of women or single women, and they basically left the guys out. So the more children they had with Great Society, the more money you got from the government. The more money you got from the government, the less you needed to have a man around to be a wage earner to support the family. And between the birth control pills and the women's liberation, the feminist movement, and the availability of all this money coming from LBJ's Great Society. The end result was that it radically changed the relationship between men and women. And a lot of these families, or a lot of these kids, were growing up in fatherless homes because the government's money coming in basically replaced the wage owner, replaced the role of a father. And the kids that grew up in those environments, and even to this day, have a tendency towards gangs and have a tendency towards crime. And something like 70% of all the young people in prison came from fatherless homes. It's the greatest problem that we have in our country today. With our social problems are coming from the lack of fathers. And this happened because the Great Society basically pushed men out, made men irresponsible. After World War II, they had a similar situation going on in Russia, because so many of the Russian men were killed in the war that there was like the women were 2-to-1 over men. And so men were considered to be prized. To be married was considered to be a prize, but in order to keep them, in the competition between women was to basically do the work. So the men became lazy and they turned to alcoholism and things like that, because they didn't have to be a father. They didn't have to be a household wage earner. And what happened was that alcoholism ran rampant in Russia, and the effects linger to this day. The relationship between men and women, whenever government comes into this, it has a profound effect on the social culture that emerges from the next generation. So here we are, driven by the Great Society of LBJ, and creating a dependent class with people on welfare for 2 or 3 generations, running up a tab that's equivalent to our national debt. And to whom did it help? Well, Democrats, prior to 1994, Democrats held the majority in Congress for 40 years. They did that by buying with borrowed money, promising Great Society kinds of solutions. So here again, when might becomes right, the people are in bondage. Well, the might of the federal dollars through welfare handouts put people in bondage. But, when right becomes might, people are free. So over like 100 years, we've had radical change in the relationship between the federal government and individual freedom. And I think that it's important to understand at a snapshot in time of what it was like 100 years or so ago, actually 150, and by a quote by Abraham Lincoln. And I want to read this to you. It's a quote: "What constitutes the bulwark of our own liberty and independence? Is it not our frowning battlements and bristling seacoasts, or army, or navy? These are not our reliance on tyranny. All these may be turned against us without making us weaker for the struggle. Our reliance is on the love of liberty which God has planted in us. Our defense is in the spirit that prized liberty as the heritage of all men in all lands everywhere. Destroy the spirit, and you have planted the seeds of despotism at your door." Well, end of quote. The Great Society welfare programs did that. They destroyed the spirit of liberty. And as a result, there's a social chaos, and a lot of the ills we have with crime and gangs and such and drugs came about because the government getting involved in areas that they had no business to. So this was the economic theory, the Keynesian theory that FDR pushed on us from during the times of the Great Depression, and became a way of life. And simultaneous to this, over in Germany, we had Karl Marx, who came up with this Das Kapital book, where he explains how capitalism or privatism is going to fail because people are too foolish to know how to handle their money. Well, Karl Marx he didn't have a regular job. He was basically living off the money of an independent wealthy friend. And but yet he thought he could, understand the economy. But even he later on realized that much of what he had written earlier as a younger man was failing. And you put that together with the some of the other social changes that were occurring at the same time, and it was just pie in the sky theory. So as we move forward through the 50s and 60s and 70s, We have the Vietnam War winding down. The Great Society is growing. Along comes Richard Nixon, who was elected basically because Johnson refused to. He made such a mess of the presidency. He decided he wasn't going to run again. So here we go, and Nixon comes along, made a lot of corrections, but we were not in a good place, and now we're dealing with international oil embargoes. We're dealing with the unpopular war in Vietnam. Even though the military was capable of winning that war, the social upheaval that was coming through the colleges and such, through the younger people, led to a withdrawal that was an embarrassment at best. And then whenever Nixon was near impeachment and he resigned over the Watergate affair, it created a whole generation of journalists who thought that now they could play kingmaker. And we see the effect of that even to this day with what's happening with former President Trump. It's the media has decided they're going to play kingmaker versus the voters. But all of this is coming about because of shifting the notion of liberty through the use of economic forces away from the individual into the government's hand. And the more you remember the golden rule, he who has the gold rules. And with more and more people dependent on government, the lack of freedom just continues to the freedom continues to be lost. Along comes Jimmy Carter. Things got worse. They were always talking about the glass is half empty, and we all got to roll up our sleeves and turn our thermostats down and wear sweaters to deal with the lack of or the rising prices of fuel, rising prices of energy. I remember those times when if you were to fill your car up with gas, if you had a license plate with an even number, you got it on one day, and if you had an odd number, you got it on the next. That's all done Jimmy Carter. Along comes Ronald Reagan. He turned all that around. We see growth again. Surpluses are coming back in. Taxes are lowered. It looks like they wanted to. One of the projects was to pay back the Social Security Trust Fund and reduce the national debt. But then remember, the Democrats were in control, and that wasn't going to happen. So it really wasn't until Ronald Reagan got into the Cold War with the Soviets and that he started talking about Star Wars and all this innovation of technology to deal with the potential nuclear threat of Russia that all got the country going again. And the money was rolling into the coffers of the government because taxes were lower and things were happening. The 80s were a good time. But then along comes George Herbert Bush, and he sort of threw away or blew the happy days of Reagan, and Bill Clinton was elected. Well, Clinton was the only good thing in the 90s was that Newt Gingrich and the Republicans got back under control of the Congress in 1994, and they actually had a balanced budget. Amazing. They hadn't had one prior to that in the 50s. So here's the pattern again. We see the tax cuts. This was followed with George Bush when he was elected in the 2000s. The tax cuts produced economic benefits to people, as well as brought greater revenues into the Treasury, which could be used to reduce the debt or to be used more wisely. But rather than doing that, the increased tax revenues was simply spent. And that just created a bigger and bigger mess. So along with some of the other programs started by Bill Clinton with housing and trying to have affordable housing and the mortgage meltdown that occurred as a result of it in 2008. Again, government meddling created a mess for everybody. So the liberty of freedom of people, again, limited because of the meddling of the federal government in areas that they had no business. So as we continue on that line about the effects of the energy, oil and natural gas, and now we've got the climate change people getting involved with the economics of liberty, and it seems like because the politicians that we have today have been so ingrained to believe that their whole purpose of life is to make more government because they've been there forever. They are no longer accountable to voters. They're just the special interests have them locked in with their monies. So they now become a function of these wild ideas about the climate. And the result is more and more emphasis on these regulations, and tie this together with all the fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy, and used to watch American freedom just slip away. This all had gone along, and Obama came along, and Barry Soweto was his real name, by the way, not Barack Obama, and with dubious credentials, and with the normal media, you'd expect that they would have vetted him, but they didn't. They wanted to have this guy in there because of what he believed. And he came in and he was going to change everything with hope that we can believe in, hope and change. Well, he did, and the economy took a setback. Then Donald Trump comes along, and he starts reversing a lot of these policies. And guess what? The economy grows again. Well, we know from the Kennedy experience, from going back to the 1920s when the taxes were lowered, back through the Reagan years, taxes were lowered. It always means greater revenue, and there's more activity, and there's more things happening. Well, Trump just came in a matter of a few years, he turned all that around. And of course, the left's going crazy because it means that their base of power is less, and they have less control over people when people have more of their own money. Well, along comes Biden, and Biden is, I call him President Magoo, because this guy just leaves a path of destruction behind him. And we see these results in the economy today, and put this all, going on at the same time as the COVID epidemic and expansion of government, and telling people what to do with their masks, and whether they could go to school or not, or whether they could protest in the streets, but they couldn't go to church. And it just really hit home that Americans realized that our amount of freedom that we've had just within a few decades is substantially less than we had after this COVID mess, and under the tutelage of President Biden. At this time, it looks like at 80-some years old, he's going to try to run again, but I seriously doubt whether anybody's going to vote for this guy, even Democrats, because he's cognitively compromised. So that's the economics of liberty. The more government you have, the more handouts you have, the more they play with the currencies, the more they play around with the energy that we have, the taxes we have. That all relates to personal freedom in a capitalist society. So when might is right, we live in bondage. When right is might, we live in freedom. When right becomes wrong, we live in chaos. This is what we're seeing today. Until either might or right becomes powerful. If it's might, we're in bondage. If it's right, we're free. Dr. Bill Choby, finishing up another chapter here in Liberty in America, Past, Present, and Future. I know this was long. I hope I didn't lose anybody over this, but I think it was a good discussion to have, and I thank you for taking the time to listen to it.